Okay, good. So, like I said, if you have questions, you can either email me, come to office hours. We'll have a little break today, about 5 to 7 minutes. You can stay after the lecture. Just let me know that you're staying and you have a question. All right. All right. Let's start with our slides. All right. Do you guys see the slides? Just to make sure.
Yes, Professor, we do.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So we are moving into chapter 2. It's still a kind of introduction in a way because we're not really doing cognitive neuroscience in this class. Like I said before, if that's what you're interested in, you should take 232, which is physiological psychology. It's an old term for cognitive neuroscience. But a lot of discussions in the textbook will be based on neuroimaging studies, and they, of course, come from cognitive neuroscience. So we'll try to just perhaps uh, refresh your memory from other courses, and maybe Psych 100 if you had that there. Okay, so this is what I have in mind. I'll remind you again that many of the beliefs that people hold about the brain are actually myths. It's quite difficult to follow the cognitive neuroscience research or just to be on top of that. It requires a really a serious education beyond the master's level. So it's not unusual that people have all kinds of weird beliefs regarding the brain. I will just remind you a little bit about the nervous system, in particular, central nervous system. That's the one that we're interested in this class. Of course, there's peripheral nervous system, which is more likely to be studied in the companion course to 232 called 239, motivation and such. Again, interesting if you are into this kind of stuff, but we won't have time to talk about it in this class. So we'll talk about neurons, a little bit of about neural communication, and perhaps some divisions of the nervous system, just to, again, just to refresh your memory, and spend a chunk of time on the human brain, the parts of the brain, functions of the brain, localization, and hopefully we'll touch upon some of the methods that we use to study cognition, including neuropsychology, which is the case studies of the famous patients, and relatively new, well, newish, I should say, methods to study the living brain, which we refer to as neuroimaging. Okay, so throughout this course, in the textbook, in the lectures, I will refer to the two sort of main characteristics of modern cognitive psychology. We touched upon on that a little bit last week on Thursday, that there are two characteristics that make cognitive psychology special, and it's something that when you see this or when you hear about this, you know that people are talking about cognitive psychology. The first one has to do with mental representations. And again, the reason behind the fact that we have to use mental representations is the fact that we are, uh, well, not oblivious, but we can't really observe cognition. If I were in class with you now, looking at you, even if you sort of follow me, I have no idea whether you actually are processing what I'm saying, thinking about it. You may be daydreaming, or you may be doing something else. So the only way to study cognition is by inference. And the inference is we suppose or presuppose that there are representations that exist, but they're mental representations. There's no amount of surgery will show us a memory trace. It's just not where we are right now. So one of the uh, characteristics of modern cognitive psychology is that fact that for each level of cognition, starting with sensation and perception, which we will move to next week, all the way to thinking and consciousness, we will be talking about these mental representations that will be specific for each individual level. So next week, we'll talk about percepts. A percept is something that has to do with the way we perceive the world, um, and things like distal and proximal stimulus. When we move to memory, we'll talk about memory traces, or I could use a term that was introduced by Carl Lashley called engram. Engram is a memory trace, and so on. So we talk about language. We'll be talking about linguistic structures that people, speakers like you guys, use. Again, there's no way that we can draw a structure of a sentence, but we can't really see how that sentence is represented in the mind. So that's the first very important characteristic of cognitive psychology. It's always referring to these mental representations. We are studying them. And to study them, we will need special tools, special experimental techniques. The second one is a little easier to observe because it has to do with boxes and arrows. Again, I mentioned that before. So whenever you see a bunch of boxes connected with arrows, one way or the other way, this would be an information processing approach, and that's what modern cognitive psychology continues to use from 1950s. We will see some of that next week. Mostly we'll see a lot of that in our chapters on attention, which is chapter 4, and chapters on memory, 5 through 7. So for example, for the memory, you'll see a classical representation of memory is consisting of sensory memory, short-term memory, or working memory. They're not exactly the same, and long-term memory. So these are 3 boxes, right? And then within them, in the modal model of memory that we'll talk about in chapter 5, we will see the arrows that take us from sensory memory to short-term memory to long-term memory. And then retrieval of information, an arrow will be going from long-term memory into short-term memory. So that whenever you see something like that, you know that we are employing information processing approach, and we're talking about stages. All right, and today we'll concentrate on mind and body. Again, something that I touched upon on Thursday in the history of cognitive psychology when I talked about René Descartes, who was a dualist and presupposed the separate existence of the mind and spirit and the body, where the body occupies the space, so the body is relatively easy to study, while the mind is one of those ephemeral concepts, a mental representation, so to speak, which in his opinion was not that easy to study because it's just apparently not there. Right? So we will have to talk about the connection between mind and body because the mind is what the brain does. So for us, it is the connection between the mind and the brain. So that's, again, this is sort of the overarching, what we call metacognitive approach to the subject. Okay, some of you have decided to actually tackle this question in your blogs, right? I always wondered where it came from. I mean, everybody talks about it, 10% of our brain. It turns out this is all relatively old. As you can see here is, for example, a quotation from 1956. The hidden 9/10 of your mental strength lies buried. Discover, release, and use it to gain new success, personal happiness, a fuller, richer life. All right. Now, it turns out that when you read those, well, today we don't fly, but in the days when we flew, we could see things like this in the ads in the airline magazines where they would say, okay, if we are only using 10% of our brain capacity, Why don't you enroll in the great courses or read the book or come to the seminar and whatever else they would advertise? Hopefully, as they would say, we will increase your brain power once you do our course, listen to our lecture, do whatever you want to do. And it was so persuasive that a lot of people started to believe this idea. Of course, it is a myth. Many of you who have chosen this particular statement showed me how you went around looking for an answer why it is not the case. I mean, it's kind of trivial that it's not the case. So here's what we know now. For quite a long time, the idea was that we have about 100 billion neurons. That's what we think about, sort of the top range of that. Now there is an actual count. I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, how do you count neurons? That's not that easy. So there's a Brazilian scientist who actually came up with a relatively new technique to calculate neurons. So according to her calculations, the lower range of neurons is about 86. Now, in addition to these 86 billion neurons, we have 100,000 miles of axons. And when we get again to refresh our memory on the neuronal structure, we'll talk about axons. So that gives us, because each neuron is approximately connected to 1,000 of other neurons, it gives about 10 trillion synapses. I mean, can anybody even imagine this kind of a number? I mean, it's actually more than stars in the Milky Way. It's crazy. Now, all of that, because it has to be supported by somehow, is supported by 400 miles of capillaries, which are the little blood vessels, right, that feed our nervous system. We also have about 1 trillion glia cells, and I'll tell you a little bit more what I mean um, by glia cells in a minute. And think about it. This is our brain on the picture on the left. So all of that, all these trillions and billions of everything are packed into these 3 pounds of flesh. Now, of course, that is an amazing feat from the point of view of evolution. Now, the actual outer layer, right, is the neocortex, which if you spread it out, make it flat, it's about 20 by 20 inches. So it's the size of a large pizza. So obviously we cannot use 20 by 20 in the flat version. That's why we have all these folds and crevices that have special scientific terms that are kind of crumpled and stuffed into our skull. All right. So, it's amazing, but it's not about anatomy. It's more than anatomy. What we really want to know is how all these cells, tissues, organ systems function. I mean, how do they give rise to the mind, really? So, what are the psychological functions of all these different brain structures? This is what we want to know. Okay. So, if we were to say that it were only 10% of the brain, it would be about 140 grams, which is the size of the sheep's brain. Obviously, we're not in that, uh, in the ballpark of sheep's brains. All right. So, in addition to the fact that it comes from all these ads and sort of older approaches, there's also a historical reason why people sometimes think about the 10% of the brain statement as a true one. So in sort of around 1800s and a bit later, there was a couple of people, and the most important one of them is Franz Josef Gall and Johann Sturzheim, who are now known as phrenologists, although Franz Josef Gall is actually a very important figure in the history of cognitive psychology. We'll come back to him several times. In particular, we'll come back to his work on imagery and images and vividness of your imagery. But in the context of today's class, we're talking about what's known as phrenology. Now, if I were in my office, I could have shown you, I actually do have the phrenology head. It's this wonderful little statue, not statue thingy. So let's get some color. What should we do? Should we do green? All right. Let's close this. Hold on a second. I need to get rid of the chat because it's in the middle. There we go. All right. Now we can go back. All right. So this is the phrenology head. Why phrenology? Well, because it was kind of fun in those days when first neuroanatomists, I mean, again, they were not psychologists, as you remember from our conversation of the psychology being born in 1879 as a science. The idea was that you can actually try to glean people's personality from various bumps on the skull. Now, of course, people have hair, but you can still go around the head and find certain areas that protrude, okay? So for the phrenologists, and the most important one would be Franz Josef Gall, who was actually a cousin of Charles Darwin. It was interesting to try to sort of glean the idea behind people's personalities by using their skulls. And we'll come back to Carl Ashley, who was also a very important sort of person who believed in localization of function, but from the 20th century. So going back to phrenology, here's the idea. So you guys sitting there in your homes, you can use your hands, your fingers, and you can try to sort of look around your head and see if you get any particular bump somewhere, something where it is not flat. Of course, the skull is not flat, it's sort of curvilinear, but you could perhaps find a place. Let's see, what do we have here? Now, if you look behind your left ear, sort of below your left ear toward the neck, if you get a bump right here, again, we'll probably need a color. So this area called amativeness, and amativeness is actually about sexual attraction and sexual desire, and you'd be surprised that the phrenologists actually came with this idea. So if you have that area that is extending sort of beyond the flat approach to the skull, you must be very sexually interested person, somebody who's interested in sex. If you get a bump just above your left ear, of course, I'm only showing you the left side, and that's combativeness. And combativeness means that it's your desire to quarrel and fight. So you're a fighter. And so on. As you can see, there is tons of various personality features that supposedly could be found on the person's skull. His benevolence and veneration. There is also, but I think it's on the right side, a brain area called parental love. So if you have a bump in that area, you're going to be a very devoted parent. Okay? So we know now, of course, that this is not exactly the idea, but there is something behind phrenology, and we'll come back to that a little later. So localization of function is really an important concept, but the phrenologists got it wrong. Of course, one of the things that Gall was doing, he was actually visiting jails, and was in the UK, and he was giving this the phrenological examination to inmates. And that's how some of these bumps were discovered. If you were to find a lot of inmates with the bumps in the combativeness area, he would say, okay, well, that means that these people are, ready to quarrel and fight. Interesting idea. So perhaps that 10% of using the brain also comes from this historical approach of phrenology. All right, so if you're interested in sort of pursuing this historical angle, you have an activity 2.1 in week 2 of weekly schedule, where you can investigate some of these phrenological faculties, of which the phrenologist discovered or discussed about between 35 and 40. So there's plenty for you to do if you're interested. Here is another a way of thinking about localization of function, not necessarily from the phrenological point of view, but from the point of view of sort of the actual case study. Perhaps you heard about it in your Psych 100, a case of Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage was actually a railroad worker, but not a plane worker. He was the head of his little team, and he was usually doing the tampering of the explosives that were used during these times to, blow the rock and create a tunnel, something like that. So in 1848, and this is the earliest case that we know of, Phineas Gage was performing his tampering using this metal rod, and for whatever reason, there was a sparkle or something. He actually managed to start the explosion, and during this explosion, that rod, I don't have a picture, but it's easy for you guys to Google that. That rod actually went through his head. The way it went through his head was from the bottom, under the chin, came out at the top. And there are these crazy photos. It's 1848. There was some way of doing this already. Some daguerreotip photos showing his face reconstructed with the rod sticking out. And the way the tampering rod went through was through, if you think about these areas of benevolence and veneration that I showed to you a second ago. But surprisingly, one would expect him to die immediately on the spot, but he didn't. There was a doctor who came and helped him. He was actually shocked, but not that much. The real pain was the pain of the rod going through the skin and tissues, not going through the brain, because the brain actually doesn't feel pain. So the doctor took care of him, and Phineas Gage actually survived the accident. Now, but what happened when you read about that in on historical sites, there is actually a site dedicated to Phineas Gage, and there are some interesting recent developments. For example, his skull was actually x-rayed to see how it happened, to see what kind of damage there was. Anyway, so what happened, he was a relatively nice, easygoing guy before the accident. After the accident, his personality changed dramatically. He became very grumpy, short-tempered. He cursed a lot, which wasn't the case before the accident. So one of the ideas was that what happened during the accident, that damage at the top of his head actually damaged the area that is responsible for person's personality. Well, now we know that the prefrontal and frontal cortex, the ones are are the ones that are responsible for our executive functioning. And the executive functioning has to do with planning, controlling, um, a lot of stuff that has to do with sort of the regulation of your life. And this is what was damaged in Phineas Gage. Interestingly, we know now from a lot of neuroimaging studies that the prefrontal cortex and frontal cortex, that is the executive functioning, develops until the age of 27. So some of you guys, I'm sure, are not 27 yet. Therefore, your executive functioning is still developing. That's why we often see in the criminal court, we see teenagers. These are young men in particular who don't seem to know how to stop themselves, how to control themselves. Well, sometimes the defense would invite an expert who would say that the teenager just doesn't have enough of executive control developed yet to be responsible for his actions. All right, so it's all about this. And then we have other clinical studies, of course, and I think you already read about patient HM at this point because Henry Molaison died in 2009. We actually can call him by name, but in the days when he was still alive, he was known as patient HM. Now, I'm going to be using these little nifty coloring images because I just like them. So here you can see, for example, I can't show you the hippocampal area on this picture because this is the outer part of the brain, but I'll show you the limbic system a little later. Here, what you can see in green is what is known as Broca's area. And one of the activities that I have for you in week 2 is to look at the case of patient whose name is Tan. Well, actually, his name was Victor Lebogne, but at the age of 30, he had a stroke and he became Paul Broca's patient, known as Tan, because that was the only thing he could say. All he would do is say Tan, 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 Tan. That's how he became another very important classical neuropsychological case in the history of psychology, because the damage to the Broca's area creates impairment in language production. Now, a little later, about 20 years later, there was another case by Dr. Wernicke who discovered another area right here. Actually, I probably should show you with colors. Done. That's correct, Abdel. Here it would be the Wernicke's area, where if you get damage in that area, you're gonna lose your comprehension. You will be very glib, you'll be talking a lot, but you won't make any sense. I'm exaggerating because obviously there are nuances of the two types, and this is called aphasia. Aphasia meaning that it's a language impairment that was acquired, usually during the stroke. All right, so let's clear that. Let me see if I can move chat without losing it. Is it in your way, guys, if I sort of keep it on the side?
No, we don't see it at all on your screen, Professor. So if you have it there, we don't think you see it.
Thank you, Abdel. Let me see. I don't know what it looks like on your side. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to just keep it because otherwise I have to look for it. All right, awesome. Okay. So this particular approach is a neuropsychological approach. And again, we'll be talking about this because neuropsychological cases is one way to think about how we can approach studying what we can't see. Remember the inference, the mental representations. So one way to do that is to look at the impairments of certain functions. Okay, so now let's move on to sort of refresh your memory about how our nervous system is organized. All right, can somebody fill in this gap for me, either in chat or if you want to say so. So we want to say that,
Brain
go.
activity.
Brain activity. Okay. Yes, Abdel, you're right. It is brain activity, but what type of activity is it? What is its biological nature?
They said that it's like sparks. It's like electric. Like they there was the different in the textbook. It was like the different kind of signs that they look for brain activity, and it was like an electrical spark that they see almost active in the mind before an action takes place.
Perfect. You are answering half of that question. So there is electrical activity, but there is also yet one more type of activity, especially at the synaptic clefts. What happens there is
Chemical energy?
chemical. Yes, Peter, thank you. So electrical plus chemical, and together as a package, we would call that neurological uh, activity. That's the activity of our neurons. And really, that's what we're interested in, right? So, okay, so now one could say it's sort of a little bit of a reductionist approach that anything that we can find, any kind of behavior, will be predicated or predicted by the neural activity. And the neural activity is going to be electric plus chemical, so that the combination of the two. So neurons, when they fire, that's electrical. When one neuron activates another through the transmission of neurotransmitters at the synaptic clefts, that's chemical. And that's all there is to it. So isn't that funny that our personality, our sadness, our happiness, all of that is this? This is what some uh, reductionists believe. They say, and that's a famous quote from Rutherford, who was a physicist. And Rutherford said, life is physical activity. Everything else is stamp collecting. Now, in those days, this was a very popular hobby. So he believed in reductionism, saying that everything is about biology and physics. There is no psychological component. Of course, we know better now. So approximately these are the levels that we will just spend a few minutes talking about. We have cells, tissues, organ systems, and the entire, and each of these tiers is hierarchical. That is, tissues consist of cells, organs consist of tissues, systems consist of organs. And then on the right, the green stuff is the biological classification, actually Linnaeus, if you think about it, which we don't really care much about, but there is a connection between the levels of biological organization at the level of the individual organism, that is a being or an animal, and the levels of sort of above that when we organize the groups, right? We have species, we have genus, family, and so on. But we are interested in the individual organization, not part, let's put it this way. Okay. So the lowest level, right? We have the cell. Why the cell? Because it's the smallest unit that can function independently. So we don't go below the cell. There are things there, of course, but we care about particular cells. This is for cells in the entire human organism, human body, but we will be interested in the particular type of cells that populate the nervous system. When you combine the cells, you get groups of cells that they are all of a particular kind. And then when you combine the tissues, you're going to have an organ. And the organ is, as you know, something that performs a particular function. You're going to go up. So this is all hierarchical from the lowest, from the cell to the highest, which is the organism. You're going to get a system. Okay. And these will be groups of organs that perform similar or related functions. And finally, you get all the systems together and you're going to get a human or an animal or any other living organism. So systems, you can think about uh, cardiovascular system, endocrine system, obviously nervous system, the one that we're interested in, but there are a bunch of others. So this is what it will look like. So cells are of two types in the nervous system. So now we are switching to uh, look at this hierarchy only within the nervous system. We're not looking at anything else. So for the nervous system, the cells are neurons or glia. That's it. There's just the two of them. Well, there are interneurons, but they are also neurons. So they are the smallest units that can function independently. And then we have tissues, which would be nerves, ganglia, and nuclei. Now, if you're doing biology or if you are interested in, uh, let's say, some like physical therapy, you'd be studying a lot of that. Again, we're just trying to understand the hierarchy because it will take us to the brain. That's what we also care about. So organs obviously are brain, brainstem, and spinal cord. Again, this is just the nervous system. Other systems will have the same hierarchy, different names. And finally, we take the brain, brainstem, and spinal cord, and it gives us it gives us the entire nervous system with two main divisions of central and peripheral nervous systems. Okay, again, this is all old and classic. As long as you understand that there is a hierarchy, you're fine. Oh, now I had that problem before. For whatever reason, this doesn't allow me to move. So I have to first change the slide and then come back to it. Okay, here we go. Let's do that. Okay. So here is our neuron. Remember, the most important piece of hierarchy in the nervous system, right? It is the building block of the entire system. And again, nothing new here, so don't panic if it looks a little strange. All you have to do is go to Psych 100 textbook or just go online and you'll see that the neuron consists of all these components, right? So we have what's known as a cell body. Let's get our color again. Okay, so this is the cell body, this whole thing. All right. So that's the neuron, the main part called cell body, and it has the nucleus in the center. So potentially is a smaller unit, but cell nucleus cannot function on its own. So we don't go below the cell. Then you're going to get these little guys that look like branches known as dendrites. They actually have dendritic spines in them, and that's really what we care about, but we continue to use the word dendrites. All right, so this is where the cell receives the signals from the other cells on dendrites. And then when it gets activated, there is enough of the activity, right? Then this impulse gets sent down a very long structure called an axon, right? Here's the axon. And the axon ends with these axon terminals. There are several names for them, but the idea is that they are the ones who will release that chemical transmitters into synaptic gap or synaptic cleft, where the next neuron will pick it up with its dendrites. All right, so it's a kind of very well defined by now structure of a neuron. We have uh, something called nodes of Ranvier, and these are sort of little like tie up pieces on the neuron because on the axon of the neuron. And then you get all this called myelin sheath, which it's like an isolation on a cable. Now, if you have a bare cable, I mean, you lose a lot of electricity. Of course, it's dangerous too. So you need myelin sheath to help the impulse to travel as fast as it can. So different neurons have different lengths of their axon. There's only one axon. There's a bunch of dendrites. And myelination is different, and nodes of Vernier are different for different neurons. In fact, if anybody is known has read about uh, multiple sclerosis, you know that one of the causes of MS is the problem with myelination. That is, neurons lose this myelin sheath, creating this uh, sort of difficulty for the neurons to communicate with other neurons, making various systems in the body of the person malfunction. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. Again, there's nothing new that I'm saying here. I just want you to uh, think what you know from your previous exposure to this. Now, if you would like to learn a little bit more and get your hands sort of dirty, so to speak, there is an activity for you where you can color and label neuronal components. The way to do that would be, once you print it and use your colored pencils, then just take a photo and post that as your uh, activity on the blog for this week. This is for those of you who are kinesthetic learners. It's kind of fun. Okay, something that is important for us to understand now, not necessarily that we will be digging into this a lot, is that the differences between neurons. So you got 86 to 100 billion neurons. They come in three versions. They are either afferent with an A, or efferent with an E, or interneurons. But interneurons are kind of easy, right? So you think of them as connected. So what do afferent neurons do? So if you have any kind of movement, sensation, anything at your sensory organs, okay, ears, eyes, fingers, whatever, these neurons carry the signal through the spinal cord and the brain stem into thalamus and into the projection areas in the brain. So think of that as affect, right? The opposite direction would be effect. That is, the brain sends signals to the peripheral sensory organs, again, through the projection areas to thalamus, to brainstem, into the nervous, into the spinal cord, into the sensory organs at the end, so you can do things. And interneurons connect the two. So affect is about bringing the signals from the outside to the brain. Effect is by having the brain operate your entire body. So afferent versus efferent. And these are the main neurons that we have. Glia cells, remember there was neurons and glia cells. So there is two of different types of neurons that we have. So these are sort of also elementary units of our nervous system. And compared to neurons, which, 6 to 100 billion, there is about 1 trillion glia cells in the human brain. So um, they're really massive. That's about 10 times as many as the actual neurons. And perhaps this is also why people have this idea that that's only 10% of the brain that we are using. Of course, it's a complete misunderstanding. So what do these glia cells do? Well, first of all, they are responsible for myelin sheath. So if you ever see an open skull, a living brain, or a brain that was just what is called harvested, you will see the two colors. I mean, it's a little pinkish, but it's basically white and gray. So the glia cells are white. So anything that is a myelin sheath would be white. The corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres is also white. These are all these glia tracts. That's why there's so many of them, because there's so many connections in the brain. Okay, so axons and dendrites develop when the child is before the baby is born, and when the baby is born, the development continues. So glia cells are the ones that are responsible for migration. That is, they reassign axons and dendrites, create new ones, connect them. All of that is really, really important. Now, if something happens, like if a neuron dies, then glia cells fill in that gap. So there is no, uh, they remove the waste and then um, fill in the space. So one of the reasons that Alzheimer's disease develops the way it is precisely, what AD is. It's a sort of a dementia, a general loss of intelligence or intellectual functions. Um, so what happens is that AD results from the degeneration of nerve cells, sometimes due to natural aging. If you have somebody in your family who has AD, your chances of developing the disease as you get older are much higher than for somebody who doesn't have any AD affected relatives. Occasionally it happens early, and then it's not something that we really know why, if it's not in the family, but it happens. Um, so what happens then? The dead tissue, right? Gli- the dead neural tissue is replaced with these glia cells, and they are the ones that give us this very characteristic plaques and tangles that are found in post-mortem examination of AD patients. We cannot really definitely diagnose AD without autopsy. So we can only guess looking at symptoms. We know a lot these days, but not enough. So the only way to fully diagnose Alzheimer's is after the patient dies and the autopsy is performed. And finally, these glia cells also are responsible for um, brain tumors, and they are sometimes called gliomas. I don't know if anybody has heard this term, but gliomas are this abnormal growth of glia cells. Again, sometimes we know why it happens, and what they do is they sort of expand and they damage other brain structures, or they prevent regular neurons from functioning. So, in that sense, glia cells can be very malicious because they can be responsible for these two very common, unfortunately, conditions in our functioning. All right. Anybody who is interested in learning a little bit more about uh, how Alzheimer's disease was diagnosed in early days? When I say early days, I don't mean 100 years ago. I mean 10, 15 years ago, because again, we're trying to be able to diagnose it in living people without waiting for them to die and then to confirm the diagnosis. The New York Times just had an article the other day where they were looking at writing patterns of people who were enrolled in a longitudinal study over a period of, I don't know, 15 years or so. So it's interesting that you can actually notice certain changes, early changes in people's writing that could be precursors of Alzheimer's. Now, of course, that's very exciting because we don't really have any good tests for that. So if there is such a thing that you can, and the diagnosis was done using an artificial intelligence agent who analyzed these people's writing at the beginning of the study, and then 15 years later, when they knew who actually, well, they knew all the way along the study why people were developing AD. So they were looking at the writing patterns, and the this artificial intelligence agent was actually 75% correct in diagnosing, the, saying that this person is more likely to develop an Alzheimer's than somebody else. Now, that's really very interesting because you can easily administer writing tests to everybody in nursing homes and in places. So it's kind of cool. So you can read a little bit about how it was done a little bit earlier. All right, we already started talking about the fact that what happens when a neuron uh, is connected to other neurons, right? Neurons themselves don't touch each other, right? They're not physically connected. They are connected through this junction called a synaptic gap or cleft. Again, these are two uh, mutually synonymous terms. Again, so there is this neural impulse, right, that gets sent from the the sending neuron through the axon, then it is released into the synaptic gap where the chemical reaction happens and the receiving neuron gets that signal, right? Remember, the this sort of neurotransmitting idea is not about the volume. It's not like the impulse can change, be high or low. That's not it. It's only about how often that impulse gets sent. The more it gets sent, the more activated the receiving neuron will be. So neurotransmitters, and this is called action potential. Perhaps you remember that. A neural impulse. That is a little uh, schematic representation of how that happens. Again, nothing new. Just to give you an idea that action potential works as one or none. Okay, so now at the synaptic gap, which is tiny, 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 we get these chemicals called neurotransmitters. Um, they flow into the synapse and they're taken up by the dendrites of the receiving neuron. The depolarization happens. This is all very nicely described in any biological textbook. Then there is another substance that comes and clears all these neurotransmitters out of the synaptic cleft, and then the cycle can begin all over again. Okay, so that's how it all functions. And that's as much as I want to talk to you about the actual sort of mechanism behind electric and neurochemical communication. All right, it's 1:12. Let's have an 8-minute break until 1:20. If anybody wants to talk to me, I will be here for you. Otherwise, go have a smoke, have a drink, whatever your fancy is, and come back at 1:20. Now to the slides. Okay. Okay, so this is our nervous system. So remember cells, tissues, and so on, organ systems, and here we are at the level of nervous system. Like I said before, we don't particularly care about the peripheral nervous system that consists of somatic and autonomic branches. Um, but we are interested in central nervous system where we actually talk about brain, brainstem, and spinal cord. Let's start with the spinal cord. It conducts those nervous impulses between the sensory organ and the brain. That's the afferent neurons. And it also does it the other way around. When the brain sends signals to the sensory organs at the periphery, the impulses go the other way, becoming the efferent. We have the brainstem. It's kind of hard to see because it's a really small structure just between the brain and the spinal cord, but it's very important. So we'll talk a little bit about it. And then there is the actual brain that we would talk more because that's where a lot of intellectual activity takes place. So here is the sort of overview of the system. Let's get the color. All right, so this is our spinal cord. It starts here. Well, it starts here on this picture. Obviously, it goes all the way down that way. All right. This component is the hind brain, and I'll talk about next. This is the midbrain, basically a reticular formation. And then comes the forebrain. This part is from the limbic system and thalamus, taken out of this picture here. This is the sagittal slice of the brain. We have special terminology for slicing, obviously, in the neuroimaging language. We can slice the brain in various ways. We can do an axial slice, sagittal slice, plane slice, and so on. And then we have different orientations for these slices. Again, nothing new here that you haven't heard in the previous classes you took. So let's now move on to looking at the brain stem or the hindbrain. And the reason we call it hindbrain is because of the terminology. And the terminology was developed for animals. Now, if you think about animals, they are kind of horizontal, right? That's, let's say, think of a dog or a cat. You have a head and a tail, and the rest is sort of parallel to the ground. Now, we walk upright, so we're like this. So in this case, we talk about, hindbrain at the bottom and forebrain at the top and midbrain in the middle. Okay, so here we have these interesting structures. If I can get my colors to move again, there we go. All right, like I said, this is the bit of a spinal cord to which the brainstem attaches. This is an extremely important structure called cerebellum, and cerebellum is basically a translation of a small brain. And actually, a lot of neurons in our brain come from cerebellum. Cerebellum's function is to keep balance and movement, and exercise motor control. That's why I say it's a very important structure. Again, not that we will talk much about it, but there are some interesting neurological conditions that could be very informative. And now we have medulla, and we have pons. Here is medulla right in here. It's medulla oblongata, and it takes care of our vegetative functions like breathing or heartbeat. So again, not so much related to the cognitive functioning per se, but without that, we can't do that. And finally, we have at the top, we have pons, sort of this purple color. This is where we take care of arousal, sleep, and waking functions of the body. So you can imagine that if there is a damage to any of these three structures, the results are devastating. The good news is it's not that easy to get damage to these three because they're really buried within the human body. Think about where it is with relationship to the head. So it's not so common, thank God, that people get uh, like traumas to these organs. The one above the brain stem, right, is midbrain. You will see that there are certain differences in textbooks about how these structures are placed in hindbrain or midbrain. I'm not taking any position on this because it really doesn't matter that much. All we care about is what these structures do. So this particular one is called a reticular formation, and the reticular formation is about arousal. A lot of the experiments came from 1940s with cats. Does anybody have cats? If you have a cat, don't listen, because a lot of that experimentation in 1940s was actually with damaging or ablation. That's a technical term that we use. Ablation means you create a lesion in cats. All right. So if the reticular formation was blighted, it was cut, then what would happen to these cats that they would just go in the state of sleep, and it was very difficult to wake them up. But on the other hand, one could constantly stimulate the reticular formation using single electrode technique, which we rarely use with people because for that we have to have an open brain surgery. It happens, but rarely. In this case, cats were constantly awake and sort of active. And only when you would turn this electric current off, they would normally get back to the cycle of sleep and awake. All right, so that was the first sort of approach, is to see what reticular formation does for living beings, in this case, cats. If you're interested in sort of trying your hand at seeing what cognitive psychology can help you with in your studies, one of the very important mechanisms that we know from cognitive psychology is how you could improve your memory. Now, I assume a lot of you think that your memory is not that good. Don't be so negative about your memory. Your memory actually is excellent, but you can make it even better. And one of the classical ways of making your memory better is to use mnemonics. Now, we'll talk a lot about mnemonics in chapter 6. This is a little bit of a preview of how one could create mnemonics or use existing mnemonics to improve your memory. So in this activity, I show you how, of course, I did not invent it. It's just I know about it, how one could use mnemonics, in this case, using full words and then taking the first letters, called an acronym, of these words to help you remember the hindbrain and midbrain structures. So I suggest you go to the activities, look at this mnemonics, and then try to sort of test yourself a little bit later, maybe in a couple of days, and see if the mnemonics presented in this exercise helped you to remember what the structures are in brain stem and midbrain and what they do. Okay, perhaps some of you know mnemonics that are used with children. So, for example, does anybody know a mnemonic for the names of the planets? Or anybody who's a musician? What are the names of the staff lines? Or the names of the 5 great lakes in the US? All of those can be memorized using mnemonics so much easier than just thinking of the regular words. All right, so I suggest, if you are intrigued, is to do this activity and see if you can memorize the hindbrain and the midbrain structures using mnemonics. And it starts with Pavlov because it starts with pawns. Okay. Okay, so here is a very interesting part. I wish we had time to talk about it, because, like I said before, it doesn't look like damage to hindbrain and midbrain structures are really that critical for us. Doing classical cognitive psychology, but there are certain ways of looking at rare cases when it happens that can be very relevant to us. So perhaps some of these conditions are familiar to you, like coma. I'm sure you at least heard about it in other courses or even saw it in the movies. The movie directors really like showing us people in coma. Less known are the other two conditions: persistent vegetative state and locked-in syndrome. Now, again, if you're interested in sort of, and especially if you are in a physical therapy training or you're thinking about physical therapy, I suggest you Google these terms and look at them more carefully. So here is a very interesting case that I just want to quickly illustrate. Hopefully the YouTube won't uh, make it too difficult for us. I would like to show you what a locked-in syndrome is. This is a case that was very famous in 1995. So that's about 25 years ago. It's a case of Jean-Dominique Bauby. And Jean-Dominique Bauby was actually editor-in-chief of the French version of magazine Elle. Elle means she. So he was 43, and he had a stroke, which is unusual for a young man, relatively young man like him. And what happened was he was completely paralyzed. His entire body, not just hands or legs, everything, with one little exception. That little exception was his left eye. With the left eye, he can actually blink. And that was the only reaction that people could see. So he was completely locked in, as we call it these days, because his consciousness was with him. He was not brain damaged in the sense that he was, forgive me for saying this, a vegetable. He wasn't. He just could not express himself in any meaningful way. He was locked in his body. So what happened, he really lived one more year after that accident. And until people realized that they could actually communicate with him with his blink of the left eye, it wasn't obvious what one could do. But then there was a journalist who helped him communicate by creating a system where he could indicate the letter. Obviously, he was a Frenchman, so he spoke French. So it was all in French. So he, with the help of this journalist and trainer, so to speak, he wrote an entire book called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, using his left eye, just blinking. And then, as you can see here, I'm showing you that movie that was shot in 2007, the same name. So this is what I was going to see if I can show you. So I'm going to stop this and see if I can show you the trailer of that movie. All right. Close this. And here. Okay, let's try that now. It should work. Let's share the sound. Okay, the sound, guys. So tell me if you don't hear anything. Can you hear the sound?
Yes,
Hi,
we can.
Professor. Yes, we can. Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. All right. So it's about 2 minutes long.
Just can't make it. You got the spell on me, and I just can't break it.
All right. So if you get a chance to watch it, I think it's available on Netflix, as far as I can tell. And it's a really moving story. The way it was presented in the trailer is from the point of view of how he perceives the world with his one eye. There's nothing else left. He sees all these people, his wife, his children, his friends, and that's it. And he's completely locked in this bubble. And that's the metaphor of the diving bell. So again, I suggest if you have a chance to watch this movie because it's really an interesting representation of what the brainstem can do, how we cannot live without that. Okay, so that's the hindbrain and the midbrain. Let's move on to the cerebral cortex, right? Because um, again, this is where most of the higher level cognitive functions reside. So think of a view of the brain from the top. We have the two hemispheres. Again, don't panic if something doesn't make sense. It's just any other intro to psychology textbook can help you with. The two hemispheres are connected through the glia cells called the corpus callosum. All right. And there's also, so you have the very thin layer of the neocortex that goes over the rest of the brain, and buried within is the limbic system. Again, here's my favorite coloring book approach. So the picture on the left shows you the left view, the left hemisphere. The picture on the right, you recognize the brain stem and midbrain, and the picture at the top is the limbic system that is buried within the brain. So what we have here is uh, a bunch of fissures, and these are these black, let's get the color going, these black lines. So two of them are really well defined. This is called the Sylvian fissure. It separates the temporal lobe, stuff in teal, from the frontal lobe in yellow and the parietal lobe in red. And there is a central fissure that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Finally, we have the occipital lobe, but there is no real well-defined fissure like these two for the occipital lobe. So most of these structures are very similar in people. There are certain differences. We don't quite know why. Uh, there are some of these individual differences, but they do exist. We have special terms. The outward folds are called gyri, it's a plural, and the singular will be gyrus. And then we have the inward folds, like crevices, and we call them sulci. The singular would be sulcus. So, of course, they're necessary, remember, because if you spread out the neocortex, the cerebral cortex, as a flat piece, it's going to be about 20 by 20, and you can't, have a head like this. So we have to make sure that everything gets sort of crumpled into the skull. Um, Without that, it would be impossible to cram all these structures into our heads. Now, interestingly, although the cerebral cortex is only about 4 millimeters thick, it has 6 layers of different neurons. Again, we won't talk much about them, but it's more complex than what it looks like. It's clear. I don't know why this chat just goes away and then I can't get it. Good. Yeah. Okay, Halaya. I see you. Now, remember that this lecture is not obligatory. You can always listen to it at your leisure because it's being recorded. So it's okay if you need to leave. You don't even have to tell me about that. All right. So these are the fishes again, and the four lobes that are critical for our understanding of sensory uh, sensation and perception that we'll talk about next week. Each of these lobes has its own function. I'm sure again that you are familiar with that. I don't really need to spend too much talking to you about this, but very quickly, frontal lobe I already mentioned in with respect to Phineas Gage's case. It's really about executive functioning. It's about your planning, your controlling your behavior, your uh, avoiding immediate gratification, stuff like that, your personality. Temporal lobe is very well studied. We know that its main function is processing of auditory information, language, speech, music, stuff like that. So anything that's auditory is a part of the temporal lobe. Occipital, again, also quite well known, is all about visual stuff. We have visual projection areas of various types, very intricate organization. We'll talk a little bit about it when we talk about imagery in chapter 8. Parietal is the least studied one. Associations, connections, some language functions, not exactly a full list of what parietal lobe does. But again, of course, not a 10%, as we know. All right. So, how did it become a neocortex? It's kind of interesting way because we can think about it from the point of view of phylogenetical development, and phylogenetic development is the evolution of the species. So we as humans, how did we become what we are? That's phylogenetics. But we can also look at it from the point of view of development of an individual, and this is the ontogenetics. So if the child is born, how does a child develop all these functions? And now here is an interesting example of three types of brains imposed next to each other. As you can see, the one on the left is the rat. I'm sorry, the one on the right is the rat. Smallest, very few sulci and gyri. Moving on to the middle, we're going to get the cat, a bit more developed. You can see the cerebellum is really nicely developed because cats are really, they really move a lot. And again, we get few sort of uh, lobes. They're not really lobes because they don't have the kinds of fishes that we do, but approximately the same configuration. At the back, we have the visual cortex. In the middle on the side, we have the auditory cortex, and then we have what we have in humans as a sensory motor area. It's not clear what they have in terms of executive functioning. I guess some cats have personalities, right? And the one on the left is obviously human, as we can see how developed that is. So that is our development as species, and this is also our development as an individual, as a child. So the child is born with most of these, in fact, if not all of them in place, all the gyri and sulci, but there is some tweaking that will be going on for quite a while, including tweaking of the executive functioning until the age of mid-20s. Now, here is the very interesting approach, because now we have tons and tons of really powerful microscopes that allow us to actually look more carefully at neocortex. So here is a photo. It's a bit colorized to make sure that we can see in more detail how it looks like. You can see that there is these somas, a somata. These are some of the neurons in colors in the foreground, but then you can see the bands of sort of light and dark. And that's the 6 layers of neurons that I mentioned just a couple of slides ago. So that's a very interesting way to look at the neocortex, thinking that's that thin, having this kind of a complex structure. If you are a visual person, if you're artistic, if you like to draw, take pictures, um, you should have a look at this activity posted for you that has to do with mm, photos that were taken by Carl Schnover. Um, he's a neuroscientist, but he also is an artist. So he took lots of pictures using fancy microscopes of the brain and put them in an art book. If you have a coffee table in your house and you have perhaps coffee table books, that would be a really good one. So some of the photos taken by Shnunova actually are available in the. There was a slideshow. I think it's still. I checked it. It was still up and running, so you could actually have fun by having a look at some of the photos that he took with his micro when he was using the microscope. Moving on from the cerebral cortex to the limbic system, or anything that's subcortical meaning it's below the cortex, that is buried within the brain, and that's the only way you can see that is really do the sagittal slicing. So thalamus is the structure right in the middle, and thalamus is known as a relay station because what it does, it takes the afferent neuronal signals and pushes them through to the different areas of the brain. So the thalamus is sort of like a controller. It decides which neuronal signals go to which area in the brain. So if you're sending, if thalamus receives a visual signal, it goes to the occipital lobe. If it receives auditory signal, it goes to the temporal lobe, and so on. Hypothalamus, again, a wonderful little structure. And all of these, except for the pituitary gland, which is not a part of the nervous system anyway, all of these structures are in twos. They come in one hemisphere and then another. So hypothalamus, it's again also a motivated behavior. That is, it controls your hunger, your sex drive, your drinking desires, and stuff like that. And the one that we really care about is the limbic system. And the limbic system in this case contains two important structures. There's more, but these two are of critical uh, importance for memory. And that's the hippocampus, actually hippocampi, if you think of the two of them, right? And then amygdala. So hippocampus, briefly speaking right now, because we haven't gotten to memory yet, is about laying new memories. So HM, Harry Melanson's problem, it wasn't his problem, but that was created for him, was precisely that his hippocampi were surgically removed because the doctors thought that it is what creates his epilepsy. In 1957, when the surgery was performed, nobody really knew what hippocampi were doing. So they thought, okay, well, we'll take them out and hopefully he'll be fine. Yes, his epilepsy got significantly better, but in the process, he lost the ability to create and lay memory. So he became and most famous amnesiac in the history of cognitive psychology. The point is that, again, we'll talk about it when we are doing memory stuff, that the way these structures were removed, it wasn't just the hippocampi themselves, but there was a lot of tissue surrounding them as well. And that's why his case of amnesia was so profound. And amygdala is an important structure because it deals with emotions. And we know that memories are tightly connected to emotions, making them much more powerful or making them uninteresting, and therefore we often don't keep them. All right, so all of that again is a preview of how we will use these structures in the chapters that will follow. Okay, our last piece for today is methods and measures. Some of that has been presented to you in chapter 1, and some of that is here in chapter 2. So I want to touch upon some of these methods, and then on Thursday we'll spend more time talking about plain behavioral experimental methods that we will be using in this class, the 3 experiments that you will have to collect data for, and then write about. All use plain behavioral methods that record accuracy and reaction time measures. But this is a bit more than what we will be able to do. So remember that Gall's phrenology was an approach. And the idea behind the fact that there is localization of function is an important one. But the approach was not so good. Okay? But we still get quite a lot of evidence from neuropsychology, and neuropsychology deals with patients. That is, if somebody has uh, damage to the brain or anything else that maybe a glioma, a brain tumor, any kind of a neurodegenerative disease or another quiet condition, most of them start with the letter A. So aphasia. Aphasia is a language impairment. Agnosia is impairment of perception, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of those, and we have many, many cases that doctors and neuropsychologists studied and presented. Um, so all of this gives us some evidence that there is a localization of function. And today we talk about faculties or brain regions that can be implicated uh, for a particular function, because we have evidence from a patient who cannot perform this particular function because he or she has a lesion in that area of the brain. All right, so how does that happen? Well, it happens obviously accidents, although a lot of these problems are derived from strokes, and that is much more frequent than accidents. So please take care of your blood pressure. Don't let it go up too high, because soon if you get a stroke, and that can happen with even with young people, more of about 12,000 cases a year are strokes in children. Now, that is so unfair. I mean, why would a child have a stroke? But it happens. So it's an important and unfortunate, very common reason for brain lesions. Surgical intervention, that was the case of Henry Molaison, whose hippocampi were removed. The one case that we already talked about in the beginning of today's class was Broca's patient Tan. His lesion after he died, Broca's performed an autopsy on Tan, and he found a profound, again, Google if you want to see what it looks like, profound damage to the area that is now known as Broca's area, or Brodmann's area 4445. We have a special atlas of the areas that was designed by Brodmann and still used. There are certain limitations to it, but it's sometimes a very handy way to refer to a particular area, like saying Brodmann 4445. I also mentioned that a contemporary of Paul Broca's, Carl Wernicke, also found, in fact, I think he had more than one patient who had issues with comprehension. So you would talk to them and they would respond with sort of word salad. So they can talk very glibly. I mean, they really are very fluent, but what they say makes no sense because they don't really understand what they're saying. And so there is a Wernicke's area. Again, these are all historical terms. There are many, many different ways of describing and working with these areas. Moreover, they are much more nuanced than just Broca's area. There's certain sub areas within that. So a very uh, important way to study these brain lesions today is using methods that have to do with voxels, and voxels like pixels. So you could actually map the brain damage in pixels. And then you could see if there is even more localization of function based on sort of pixelated information. So we know from some recent studies that certain pixels damaged around Wernicke's area can impair person's naming function in particular subclasses of words. So certain damage will result in a patient's inability to name tools. So you show them a screwdriver and they say, I know what it is, but they can't name it. Or you show them a monkey and they say, yeah, I know what it is, and they can't name it. So that ability to go beyond the sort of crude areas has changed dramatically in the past 20 to 30 years. All right, I have a little activity for you. I already mentioned that. If you're interested in what Paul Broca, how Paul Broca studied Victor Lebon, who was the actual patient ton. So do the activity, read the article, and answer a bunch of questions on that. Perhaps most interesting and sort of exciting stuff is the neuroimaging uh, experiments that we we when I say we, it's not just medicine, medical science, but psychological science um, have been using lately. So you can do both. You can use these techniques to treat patients, but you can also use these techniques to study patients. So applied versus basic research. Now, I already mentioned to you the work with the cats that had to do with the damage to reticular formation or stimulation of the reticular formation. That was done with electrical stimulation using single uh, electrodes. Here is the picture of how it's done. It looks a little gruesome. So here is a rat who has an electrode embedded into the rat's brain, and it stays there for a while until all the recordings are completed. Um, we do use single electrodes with humans, but it's only under special cases when a person is undergoing an open brain surgery. It usually happens with epileptics. So sometimes the only way to figure out how to control epilepsy, which is a very debilitating condition, is to figure out where these epileptic storms originate. And that's not always obvious. So in this case, the open brain surgery is performed and electrodes are implanted into the patient's brain. Everything is sort of covered, and then the patient stays in the hospital for a while. And whenever the problem is they're waiting, the doctors are waiting for this epileptic storm to happen, but you can't predict when it will happen. So, of course, you can't live with electrodes implanted in your brain forever or even for a long time. It's a relatively invasive procedure, but it happens. So, in this case, these patients are not only receiving this electrical stimulation as treatment, but they also are being recorded in terms of trying to figure out which particular neurons are responsible for the epileptic seizures that happen in these people. Again, but mostly single electrode electrical stimulation is reserved for work with animals. And uh, really, one doesn't even have to euthanize them anymore. So the electrodes can be removed and the animal can continue to function So it's possible. In the old days, of course, most of the animals in the situation were euthanized after the research was closed. Now, something that I want to show you, because I'm sure you haven't seen that, is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. In this technique, we take advantage of the fact that there is a magnetic field in our brain, and this magnetic field, it's weak, obviously, but it can be aligned with the sort of the rest of the of the world, magnetic fields all over us. So in this case, it's also an electrical stimulation, but it creates, what it does, it's like uh, it's like a, I don't know how to call it, like a video game where you can do things that are not real. So it's a reversible damage. I know it sounds a little too strong. So you can send that transcranial electric stimulation in a particular area of the brain, and you take it out for a while. You can take it out for 10 minutes, you can take it out for 20 minutes, you can take it out for 2 minutes. You don't have to do any surgery, right? So it's not like a single electrode stimulation. You don't need to open up the scalp and the skull, right? So this little thing on the right is the magnetic coil, all right, that gets applied to a person's, part of body. In this case, we are looking at the head, so it's applied at the scalp. And then there's a magnetic pulse that goes through the machine into the person's head. If you think about, it's about 2 Teslas, so it's like MRI in the clinical medical work. So it's not too bad. Now, so what it does, the magnetic field changes very rapidly, because it goes like this, and then it induces an electrical field on the surface of the cortex. So it's all very, very shallow. And this in turns generates neural activity, and this neural activity interferes with the ongoing electrical activity of the brain. Remember, electrochemical the way our neurons communicate, right? But only in that area where this TMS is being applied, all right? So what happens, the normal activity of the brain is interrupted because of this TMS. And what can happen is we can ask a participant to do something, right? So, for example, if we apply the TMS the way it is shown here at the back of the brain, it goes to the occipital lobe, and therefore it interferes with anything that has to do with visual perception. So I'm going to show you a very short clip of how it works, because I think it's really cool. You don't get to see that too often. Okay, let's see if it's working.
So Vince, you've brought along this special machine that influences the brain. So we're going to see it in action in a moment. But before we do so, let's start with a very simple demonstration. Do you know the nursery rhyme, Baa Baa Black Sheep?
I think so.
Could you give us maybe the first line?
Baa Baa Black Sheep, have you any what?
That's very good. It's reassuring to know that professors still know their nursery rhymes. Or you can choose anyone. Okay, I'm going to get you to repeat that. But this time, I'm going to stimulate this part of your brain with your machine. Start, please.
Baa Baa Black
Don't be alarmed. You're perfectly okay, Vince, aren't you?
I'm fine, yes, I do know it, yeah.
That's very good. Somehow this machine has disrupted Vince's brain. Well, this is a transmagnetic stimulator. It's delivering a very powerful magnetic pulse for a brief fraction of a second. But why is it disrupting Vince's ability to speak? Well, I'm going to give you a clue with the next demonstration. Have a look at this old television over here. And I'm going to need a magnet. Now, you can see the image on the television is perfectly normal. But look what happens when I bring a magnet close to it. You can see that the image is being distorted by the magnet. Now, why is this? Well, remarkably, the answer comes from none other than the founder of the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures, Michael Faraday. Because Faraday discovered over 150 years ago, and often demonstrated in this very theater, that there's a relationship between magnets and electrical fields. Now, the image on a television is produced by an electrified beam, so that when I bring a magnet close to it, it's distorting the path of that beam, and that's why the image is being distorted. So let's put these pieces of information together. A magnet can disrupt an electrical field, and we know that the magnet is disrupting Vince's ability to speak, which is a product of his brain. So we can conclude that the brain must be using some form of electrical communication to make you speak. Is that roughly correct, Vince?
True, yeah.
Okay, Vince, but if I put a magnet next to my head, it doesn't seem to disrupt any of my ability to speak, so why is that?
That's because the field that you've got next to your head is static. Even though you're moving it about, it's moving very, very slowly. To create an electric field that disturbs brain cells, it's got to be moving very, very rapidly. Every one of those clicks you hear is 1/10,000th of a millisecond. So the field has to change very, very quickly to create any electricity in the brain.
Would you like me to do some more disruption of Vince's brain?
Okay. So that's a very cool method that can tell us about localization of function. The single cell recording, we're almost done. A single cell recording was also applied to more work with cats, and David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel's cat research allowed them to discover what we now call mirror neurons. In those days, it was 1961, 1963, we didn't know about mirror neurons. So they were doing research with the cat, and the cat was actually immobilized, having an electrode implanted in the cat's brain, and the cat could not move. So what was moving was a transparency. In those days. There were no ways to do it the way we do it now with a presentation on the computer screen. And the transparency, they're trying to figure out which neurons in the cat's cortex were responsible for what. And suddenly there was nothing. They connected the electrode to a machine that generated noise, clicks like you heard in the TMS. Suddenly the neurons started firing very rapidly. They didn't understand why it was happening until they realized that what happened, they moved the transparency over the machine that projects it, and the edge of the transparency created a line. And this line was moving up and down. And this is what the cat's electrode was responding to. So there was one single electrode that was firing in response to a horizontal line. So for this work, Hubel and Wiesel were awarded a Nobel Prize because they found this localization of function at the level of individual electrodes. Finally, these are the two methods that I described quite nicely in chapter 2. We in fact use it a lot in cognitive psychology and in bilingualism in the area that I work in, and this has to do with electroencephalogram recording, or if you do it multiple times, you create the response of the brain to the same stimulus many times, and that's called event-related brain potentials. So again, people in cognitive psychology use these methods a lot. The person in the picture is actually wearing one of those ERP caps. We do have the system at the Graduate Center, in fact, in several departments. It's a very interesting way to see how our brain reacts to certain stimuli. In this case, it would be language stimuli. And finally, we have the fMRI and MRI, and we used to also have PET, less so these days because PET is a positron emission tomography. It requires an injection of radioactive substance into the subject participant, and we don't do it that much. So the most of the neuroimaging research today is conducted with functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, functional because it shows the brain the way it functions, versus plain MRI that gives us just the structures of the brain. Okay, at this point, please remember that you should be doing your blogs. The blog for week 2, which is now, is available to you until Monday, and you also should do your quiz 2 on chapter 3, which is sensation and perception, also by Monday. And to remind you that next Tuesday, the February 16th, you have to finish data collection for your first experiment. Otherwise, the class is over. Thank you guys for attending, and I'll see you all on Thursday. If you have a question, stay, and I will answer that. Yes, Siver.
Hi, Dr. Sekarina.
Hold on a second. Let me stop recording. 1 second.